who've been here throughout and taking your Sunday to learn about best practice in investment promotion. For those of you who just joined and weren't in the last workshop, I'm Courtney Fingar. So I have a few hats. My previous hat, or the hat that I was wearing for the previous session, is as a senior advisor for the World Association of Investment Promotion Agencies. I am also an FDI consultant and run my own consultancy called Fingar Direct Investment. I'm really pleased to be co-leading this workshop along with a great expert in the field, Douglas Vandenberg, who is the founder and owner of NxtZones Consultancy. Douglas has a huge amount of experience in investment promotion and FDI advisory work, and is a particular expert in special economic zones. I've just realized we don't have the clicker, the famous clicker. I'll hand over to Douglas to say a few words of introduction while I track that down.
Thanks, Courtney. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, I'm switched on now. Apologies, I was rushing to get here, but I'm glad to be here. Welcome, everyone. Everybody who has taken coffee or a juice, take your time and get seated. I'm not a person that really stands behind this because I like to walk around and interact with you. This is the workshop. I haven't shaved this morning. That's why, because it's a workshop. We need to work. And I'd like also your input as well on some of the topics that we will be discussing. Just as much as this is a workshop for you, it's always a learning experience for us as well, in terms of what do other countries do, what do other organizations, how do they plan, how do they strategize, which structures do they take, which sectors do they focus on. So it's an interactive learning workshop. Courtney has just briefly introduced herself. Let me introduce myself as well. My name is Douglas Vandenberg in English. But I've worked with Courtney for quite some years already. We thought to join hands for this workshop because she shares a lot of experience as well. She's been involved in the field of FDI and investment promotion and special economic zones for the last 25 years or so. So we share a similar history and share sort of the same DNA. I've had a number of engagement. I started my career at KPMG, then went on to EY, spent some time at the UN, and eventually ended up setting up my own company with a few partners. We sold in 2018, and nowadays we are much more focused on special economic zones and FDI as well. And we look at SEZs more from a field of not being tax havens or preferential free zones where you can get all these tax benefits and all these financial incentives, but we look at it more from a field of how does it impact the local economy and how can special economic zones and free zones contribute as much to attracting FDI and creating jobs and being a source of revenue for the governments as well, and creating sort of the benefits that FDI has. And I think in many of your countries, special economic zones do and should have that function to create more economic development, have bigger impact of FDI. But I think if we can have a brief round of introductions, and you don't necessarily have to say a whole text about what you do and what your experience is, etc., but just your name and the organization you present and which country you work for, what your position is. I don't know who would like to start. Let's start with the over there, please. Go ahead. Yeah, here, please. Yeah, sure. Okay, very good. Yes. Okay, very good. Both from Nigeria. Yes. Very good. Yes, please go ahead. Adia, very good. Yes. Adia, Abu Dhabi Investment Office. Sorry. Yeah. Yes. Next one. Please, this row here. Sorry, Matthew, didn't have time to read. So, yes. Very good. I think you just, yes. Okay. No, there's no escapes this afternoon. No way. Okay, very good. Thank you all. Thank you. Nice that you gave us the room, that you introduced yourself. I think we have a diverse group of people in terms of geographies and in terms of what everybody does. It's also good to hear that Europe is underrepresented, which is good. You know, we're focusing on the emerging and future economies of the world. I think the US is also slightly underrepresented with you, and then I think from San Francisco. So we also have a group where there's a few companies as well. Semiconductors, AI, artificial intelligence, a very hot topic these days, and we'll be talking about some of these emerging industries as well. Okay, let's get started. Any questions beforehand? Oh, okay. Okay, what we do today is we're doing two things. We're actually, if we look at what the presentation is about, we're going to be looking at the future of investment promotion agencies or future of investment promotion. We're going to look at it from an external perspective, so the outside world, how does that influence the organizations that we are all running or that we are all part of? And we're focusing on a number of topics. FDI, is FDI in trouble? There's many rumors about FDI, what the direction is, and which economies are attracting FDI, which ones are losing FDI, and in general, what are the trends in FDI? From an internal, and there's a few topics as well, sustainability, industry 4.0, but we get to those topics as well. The main theme here is, and also looking at your investment promotion work that you do from an internal perspective. What can you change within your organization? And what should be your focus for the next coming years? In terms of what is your mandate? Should it be expanded? Should you take more responsibilities? Also looking at some budget examples as well. What is the institutional structure of your organization? How do you work together with other departments in the government? FDI is teamwork. It's not something that can be done by one person. You need to work together within your government, which is a challenge, we understand. But there are ways to do that and to share a common goal and a common objective to reach some of your results. We look at some of the digital tools. Courtney will be talking about that as well. Which tools can you use? Should you digitalize everything or should you take part of it? You know, the human factor is also still important. And what is the impact of FDI, which is becoming increasingly important. To share you one example, we've been working in one of the countries here in the region, and this was on special economic zones, and they have put forward a real strategy that they really want to measure, and this may sound boring, but they really want to measure the impact of foreign direct investment within the special economic zones. But you could do something similar. I think many similar organizations like investment promotion intermediaries, investment promotion agencies, do only assess, for instance, does it attract investment, does it attract FDI, where is it coming from, in which industries, does the investor create jobs, how much capital are they investing? But you can do more. FDI can do more, and I'll show you some examples as well. Courtney.
Okay, so we'll talk a bit about the factors that are impacting FDI. No real surprises on this list. These really sit in this bucket of external factors, so things that unfortunately you as IPAs cannot control. You can learn to surf some of these waves and you can help your national economies mitigate against them, but they are things out with your control. Of course, the first is the ongoing impact of COVID, although you know, the WHO declared, I think only yesterday or 2 days ago, declared the pandemic is over, but the effects ripple on because it so fundamentally changed the way that we do business. And one of those is third on the list, which is the supply chain disruptions. There are other factors that have continued that, such as the war, which is factor number 2. But the lessons of COVID in the sense of the vulnerabilities of over-reliance on certain production nodes has really caused companies to have a wholesale rethink of how they structure their supply chains and as a result structure their operations globally. Remote working, of course, which is on the list but is an after effect of COVID, has also changed a lot of calculations about talent pools. So as you as IPAs talk a lot about your talent pools, but some of these pools are no longer concentrated. They're sort of just drops of water spreading out all over the place. So that changes the way you need to talk about your talent, where it's located, how you're calculating your talent pool, but it's also changing company calculations because talent is such a big driver of FDI. But now how do you measure what happens now when your workforce can be scattered around the world? How does that influence your decision making in terms of where workers are located? Automation, which has enabled some of this remote working and flexible trend, of course, is changing production, changing the way we work, changing what the jobs of the future look like. AI jobs are the single most important category of jobs when it comes to demand. When you look at figures about what kind of roles companies are hiring for, it's AI at the top. So of course that fits into the kind of skills that you need to have in your location to make sure that you can compete. ESG is now essential, underpins companies' calculations about how they operate, but also where they operate. Some investment promotion agencies have really taken the lead, and this is a really good example of a broad factor, a broad business trend, but where investment promotion agencies can really embrace it for the betterment of the FDI that comes in and for their own economies and the people they represent. Some agencies like Cinde in Costa Rica have been out in front of this trend, and they put ESG criteria on any investment that they would facilitate, and they will not facilitate an inbound investment that doesn't meet ESG criteria from companies that don't meet ESG criteria. So this is where you can really play an active role. A factor, again, beyond your control is inflation that, of course, is impacting currencies, is impacting the cost-quality ratio substantially. Now, there's a slight equalizer in that inflation is pretty much a global problem. Some places more than others, but everyone, nearly everywhere, is suffering from it. But it does impact companies' liquidity. It impacts their decision-making, so you need to be aware of those factors. The race to net zero, a challenge and an opportunity, of course. We talked in a previous session about renewable energy investment. This is an area where this is a broad trend that is not going to change and not going to reverse, and you as investment promotion agencies can really be out in front, be major drivers of it by actually facilitating investments into your jurisdictions that can help your national economies and the companies there meet net zero obligations. Finally, protection protectionism and deglobalization. Now, deglobalization is probably a little bit over-exaggerated, but nonetheless, we are seeing increased regionalization. That fits in with the trend of restructuring supply chains, shifting value chains, and shifting trade flows. We are seeing a continuing wave of protectionism that has a bit of a dampening effect on FDI flows. Again, you can't always influence these trends or even your national policies, but you can serve as advocates for the importance of FDI in open markets.
Thanks, thanks, Courtney. I think a lot of those, yes, please, sir, go ahead.
Is it okay if I ask a question?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, no, sure. It's an interactive workshop, so please do. Yeah.
I think there are a couple of points that I would like to add here, if you allow me to. We have seen the recent fall of three major banks in the U.S., and obviously that has created a lot of disturbance and confused the markets and also the investors. Do you think there got to be more rigid requirement in terms of the compliance, risk management, and also at the same time repatriation of capital of the investment? And I think those are the two, the compliance and the repatriation, those are the major factors that hamper the FDI process.
You're actually right to point that out as a major factor. And I mean, there are a lot of aspects to it. One is that these bank failures are spooking markets, but they're also throwing up a potential risk of wider contagion in the international financial system, which of course would be a disaster on all fronts, and including not only for FDI, but in general. So we have to keep watching that, because the more and more it starts to look like dominoes, that's very alarming. But of course, that will hit confidence, which is crucial to FDI and crucial to investment. And when people get spooked, that is when you see people withdrawing capital, and you see these knee-jerk reactions. And this will add to protectionism. In terms of enhance, or I'd say added, it may or may not enhance things, but increase regulation, I think that's almost certainly coming down the pan in the U.S. In March, I was at the MIPIM Real Estate Investment Conference, and there was a panel of leaders in U.S. real estate, but financiers, but also representatives from some of the U.S.'s largest banks, like Citi, J.P. Morgan, and Morgan Stanley were all represented. And the previous bank failure had just happened that week, and their panic was clear. And all they talked about on this panel was, oh no, we're going to have more regulation that's actually going to impact our ability to lend. And of course, that's when you'll see some dangerous ripple effects throughout the system.
Yeah, I think there got to be a sensible balance, rather than just throwing the simple investors.
Of course. Of course, I mean, it's complicated. One of the problems that has been exposed in the U.S. is that the previous banking, Frank Dodd regulations that were put in place to protect the system after the previous financial crisis had a certain threshold, and banks under a certain amount did not have to meet those obligations, and it was something like 50 billion. But then in 2018, people got complacent, the government got complacent, raised the threshold to 250, and the bank that collapsed, Silicon Valley Bank, was sitting around 200 billion, did not have to meet those capital adequacy requirements. So that shows the folly of moving around the benchmark. But this will be a challenge. This is a U.S. crisis right now, but we're seeing bank issues in Europe as well. And usually these things don't stay contained. You know, they ripple around.
Anything that happened in the U.S., it has a major impact on the market. By the way, I'm at Citi, so I know the country.
Thank you for the question.
Any other questions in relation to these factors impacting FDI? I think one of the few things that I'd like to add, you mentioned remote working and talent. Talent has become one of the key drivers and key sources also for FDI. If you don't have the availability, it's not only talent within your location. I think that's what Courtney was referring to, remote working. If you can provide access to talent through your location, that's also a benefit, because talent doesn't necessarily, it's not location bound. It's quite flexible in terms of where it's located. So access to talent is also important for investors. And what is done within your jurisdiction to retain talent? We've all seen examples where economies are very fragile and where talent tends to move away. and the retainment of talent and the development of talent that comes together. It's a bit like productivity. You know, having productivity is one thing, but keeping and maintaining productivity levels high is also should be the concern. And sadly enough, we have many economies today which are very volatile in terms of political cycles as well, where politicians no longer hardly take that long-term perspective. And that is very counterintuitive to FDI, because FDI in essence is a long-term process. And as we will show throughout this presentation, it's not something that's done overnight. If you want to sell your products to someone who's based in another location or another country, that is much easier. But FDI involves a real capital transfer. It often involves hiring or leasing a building or building something from scratch or finding a brownfield site or something like that. And there's all sorts of processes involved in FDI that you don't have when you're just trading between nations. The funny thing is also, and I think Matthew, you should be able to confirm on that, is that many economists, it took a long time before they really understood what the dynamics and what the real motivations are of FDI. A traditional economist like Paul Krugman, for instance, very famous, did not really understand what the difference was between trade and FDI. FDI is basically just, you know, it could be replaced by exports, it could be replaced by trade, but that's not the case. FDI, there's reasons why companies really relocate to other jurisdictions. And I think those factors, and in that sense we're living in a sort of changing landscape and a changing paradigm shift, where those parameters are changing and are in flux, and they're very volatile and very fragile. Another example is, for instance, what's taking place now, protectionism, deglobalization, regionalization. In essence, many industries have not become global yet because they still operate in the sort of the more or less three triads: North America, Europe, and then sort of Asia, China. And sometimes there's intra-regional changes, but not as much as there's many continents, many countries that are still left out in terms of the FDI growth that many other countries have seen over the last 30 years. Okay, let's move on. This is something that has become increasingly important, and Courtney already referred to it when we talked about risk management with the banks that are with the banks in the US. Transparency, and this relates to policies, it relates to all sorts of policies, investment policies that countries have, incentive policies that they have, labor regimes, trade regimes, or trade permits that need to be obtained when you settle down as an investor in a new jurisdiction. Investors today want no more than ever want transparency, predictability, and stability in policies. They want to really understand when they invest today that the policy, for instance, of receiving specific incentives, financial incentives like corporate income tax deductions, are still in place in 2 years' time or 3 years' time. And with the volatility in policy making, with the changes in the political cycle, it's very difficult to create that predictability and stability. Transparency is something that don't make the regulation or the policies too complex. If you can't explain it in just 1 page or 2 pager, becoming increasingly difficult to, as an investment promotion officer or someone that wants to attract investment, to explain which policies are in place and how does it really work. Keep it simple. Don't make the policies needlessly very complex. Yes, sir. Yeah, all the policies that relate to FDI. And that's why I said FDI is in essence quite complex, because it doesn't touch only towards investment or FDI policies. If someone wants to establish a manufacturing facility, it relates to employment policies, labor policies, industrial policy, visas, immigration policies. With trade, you only touch upon trade policies as a country. So that's, and make them very simple and make them very transparent. And there seems to be a movement towards making everything very complex. But in essence, we need to drill it down to what is really critical and what is really important. Yes, sir. So that is that a comment or a question? It's a question. It's a bit of both. Yeah, okay. I think the reason why countries set up special economic zones in essence was not only because they wanted to offer financial incentives, but to keep the ease of the business environment quite accessible. Because the base economy, which is the economy outside the special economic zone, had regulation that was very complex. And the special economic zones were able to offer a very transparent ease of doing business environment that was not applicable in the rest of the economy. And that's a drive. And that's also when the World Bank and the International Financial Center started talking about SEZs, that they could be sort of examples for how the rest, or test grounds for how the rest of the economy could be regulated. But that sort of got forgotten. And now sort of SEZs or free zones are islands of isolation within an economy. And I think that's what many countries should avoid. A special economic zone is just a nice, it's no more than a demarcated piece of land with a fence around it, and where you make sure that the business regulation and the facilities and the incentives are available, but that you also guarantee that the rest of the economy is not a chaos. And it could be an example of how the future of your country can be regulated and could be seen as an investment destination. So and a typical economist would say an SEZ is a suboptimal solution. Because it's actually only the suboptimality lies in the fact that you want the rest of the economy to be attractive as well. Anything to add, Courtney?
Yeah, well, I would agree with that, and it's that they are necessary and useful when in such case where you're struggling to attract investment and where the general business environment is perhaps not quite what it yet needs to be. Then they're useful because it does give that vehicle. And as Douglas said, it also takes you maybe a step down to that road, and it can be an avenue for liberalizing the rest of the investment regime. So it's kind of a necessary step in a lot of places, even in terms of ideology. If you're in an environment where taking all those steps to liberalize the investment regime and the economy is maybe a bridge too far for people, it's a way to carve that out and show a footprint. But in an ideal world, you wouldn't need them, would you? Because in theory, if the rest of the environment was conducive to investment, you wouldn't necessarily need them, but they are still essential in a lot of places.
Okay, this is just an example of how the competitiveness cycle works. I don't want to make this too complex, but what you see is you have an economic policy, and underneath the economic policy, you can take pictures, that's fine, but you will get the presentation in PDF after the workshop, so don't worry. Economic policy, you have all the policies that you refer to as well, labor policies, investment policies, incentive policies, etc. You want to track FDI projects, and that's based also on the global economy, the openness versus protectionism, industry trends, and firm strategies as well. So that the FDI projects that you attract create economic growth, and they contribute to the economic growth of your country. And they contribute to the skill and capacity development of your staff. And remember, skills and capacity development is something different than education systems or education levels that people have. I always compare it with a driver's license. A person that just got his driver's license, he or she may be able to drive a car technically, but is not a person that has the skills and the experience in terms of driving a car. It would be very foolish to jump into a car. My daughter just got her driver's license, so that's why I know. And she can drive, but I wouldn't drive with her from the Netherlands towards Spain because she doesn't have the experience yet. That's something similar with skills development. Even if a person has a high university degree, just comes into the labor market from college, they have, or she has good qualifications, but that's when you actually only start to build up your experience, and that's when you start to learn things. So skills and capacity is something different than education systems. Often when we've worked with investors in different jurisdictions, you have meetings with IPAs and they show you all the, the engineering capabilities and the levels of education that in general the population has, which is good. But what they're really interested in, what are their skills? What is their experience in working in this industry? So it's difficult to measure, but it is very important. So that FDI, through economic growth, creates, through FDI you generate more economic growth. As soon as companies are more embedded in economy, you get the indirect effects. You get the international experience, technology and knowledge transfer. That all improves the competitiveness of countries, and that enhances the potential to actually attract more investment. So it's a cycle. And if you understand this cycle, you'd also understand how you can play a fundamental role in that. Actually nurturing investment and growing investment in your jurisdictions is very important. IPAs often talk about aftercare, but aftercare is not just after a project has landed, but aftercare is actually for the next 10, 15 years, or even 20 years that you follow investors, and you make sure they create those indirect effects, which are very important. And if you look at it, and this is what we created some time ago, if you look at the impact and the benefits of FDI, and you look at the time frame that you have, you would see that many countries actually have an FDI gap, what we call an FDI gap, because the curve tends to flatten. A couple of years ago, we thought flattening the curve is great because it diminishes the numbers of COVID. But for FDI, it should exponentially grow. And it doesn't really happen. You'd see a lot of countries that don't really look at those long-term effects of FDI or create those long-term benefits. So sometimes even when you have existing investors, they could even contribute much more to creating a better impact of FDI than the short-term first-time investors, the new investors. Any questions to this? It's a very simple way of showing, how the impact of FDI sort of grows over time. What we also see in the changing context of FDI is that and I'm going to focus a bit about that in the next couple of slides when we talk about FDI 4.0, which is FDI related to Industry 4.0. But what it also shows, as I mentioned before, is that FDI, if you look at the ways companies can expand internationally, FDI is probably the most risk sensitive and also the most complex one, because exporting is easy, and then you have all the other sort of intermediate forms of how companies can create international business. But this doesn't mean that when you look at those big benefits that FDI can have, or that FDI or that international forms of business can have on your economy, these forms also have an impact. And what you actually see, especially in high technology sensitive sectors, is that they're not necessarily looking at FDI as the holy grail for investments. They're looking at, for instance, at strategic alliances or joint ventures, which are less complex. It's a new form of expanding internationally. So if you're able to, and it doesn't really matter because you can still create the benefits. It's not necessarily that FDI is the holy grail of economic development. In fact, you can even go so far as that for some countries, FDI is quite difficult, but that doesn't mean that there isn't potential, because through alliances or joint ventures or strategic partnerships with companies, you can still create that knowledge transfer, you can still create jobs, you can still have the benefits that FDI would also generate. So it's important to realize that, because new forms of investment, as we tend to call them, are growing quite rapidly, and especially in high-tech industries or technology-sensitive industries. What we also see, and this is a simple one, and actually I've been able I wish it was different, because I've been able to use it for the last 5 or 6 years actually, but you actually see this is, when you look at the, let's take 10, 15 years ago, the difference between developed markets and emerging markets in terms of costs was quite high. That explains why everybody went to these low-cost jurisdictions like China, but also in textile industries to Bangladesh, etc. But it also explains why we sort of created these production, global hubs for production and exporting. And the risks were actually not that big, because there was more stability in global markets. And this is it's not based on the actual numbers, but it's something that we've seen in differences between developed markets and emerging markets. What we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years, that the cost differential has minimized. It's become less. So the difference between producing in developed markets and emerging markets, the cost differential has diminished. At the same time, the risks have expanded. So that creates a very difficult landscape for investors as well. And it also contributes to what Courtney just mentioned in terms of globalization. And also it relates to the fact that FDI is quite complex in essence. So why bother? That's actually what you hear companies say. No, let's not make life too difficult. Try and find other solutions. Companies, in essence, are lazy when they think about international strategies. Why should we do it? It's a typical boardroom question that you would see in small and mid-sized companies, but also in the larger multinationals. Why should we do it these days? Like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, give us a justification to go to China, which was a totally different strategy. They wanted to go to China because everybody was going to China. So they needed the justification. So they hired McKinsey or Booz, or they gave them the justification. They could sell it to the trade unions, they could sell it to the workforce, etc. But today the question is different. Can we do it another way? Can we internationalize or strategize or internationalize our production through a different way? Where the risks are minimal and we accept some form of cost differential, but it's not that big, so why bother? Why take the huge risks? And it's something that you have to work with as a country when you're attracting investment. You could actually tap into that. So taking care of the risks associated the risk associated with investments in your country. Yes, gentlemen, please.
Yeah, I think it probably would help everybody, including myself, if we can expand on that risk element. Are we talking about the financial risk? Are we talking about the scalability risk? Are we talking about the productivity risk? Are we talking about the financial? Are the human resources loss? Are not developing human resources in a timely manner to do the scalability and take it to the next level?
Yeah. No, good question. This risk is associated to all the risks, and all the risks have repercussions on costs. Whatever it is. If it's operational risk or security risk, that has a repercussion on costs for many companies. So we're talking about most of the risks that are associated with FDI, which are many. It's not only just financial, but it's also about operational risks. Think about electricity supply. Is it stable enough? Are there disruptions in the electricity supply that have an impact on the production process? Where you have disruptions and you can't produce your car supplies or your semi-finished products that you need to export. Those are the real risks that companies are confronted with in many markets, and they want to have at least some predictability and how they can assess those risks. If you understand the risks, you can deal with them and you can manage them. But if you don't understand the risks, you can't manage them and you can't predict them either. The oil industry is typically an industry that is very much equipped with managing risks. They've all gone to very fragile states, volatile states, very difficult countries to deal with, but they always were able to manage those risks. And the risks were actually lower than the benefits. It's a simple calculation in essence. Industry 4.0, huge development. We were talking about AI, artificial intelligence, but there's more. When you look at, this is just a brief introduction of the fourth industrial revolution. It has an impact not only on traditional industries, but it's creating a new wave of industries as well. And that's where the potential is. A couple of years ago, we were only talking about how Industry 4.0, through its new technologies, was changing existing industries like manufacturing, 3D printing. But nowadays, you can actually see, take artificial intelligence, it's a nice example because it's been in the news quite a lot over the last couple of months. It's a new industry. Obviously, it has an impact on traditional industry like pharmaceuticals, medical devices, automotives, electronics, but it's creating an industry in itself. And within that industry, you have different types of sectors and subsectors. And think about it, that industry can actually, that newly created industry can actually have a benefit for your country as well. I think there's a company in the UK that it's called Data, may come up to the name. They've actually created a new database with all the new and emerging industries that are growing in the UK and also in the US. The company's growing quite rapidly because they're sort of taking an architectural role to understand those industries and which companies are there operating within those industries. And it's growing exponentially. So don't think of it as Industry 4.0 that changes your traditional industry. Think of it as an opportunity as well because it has lots of new industries as well. And we'll be highlighting a few as well. Obviously, as I mentioned, challenges, disruption of traditional industries, and the required labor skills. Again, talent is becoming an important one. But the opportunities are there, as I mentioned. Some of those industries are emerging as becoming more more popular, but also growing in terms of their developments. Well, these are just some examples of how it has changed. I think the best example is always Airbnb. It's probably the biggest real estate firm in the world, but it doesn't own any assets, which is very strange. But it's perceived as one of the biggest real estate companies. I don't know whether we should have SpaceX there due to the recent, but it's still, trying and testing. OpenAI, in the news quite a bit. I think the head of artificial intelligence from Google, actually the founder of artificial intelligence, has just left Google, and was because of the fact that many of the developments in AI were actually going too fast and were not creating the benefits as they were perceived initially. But that's a separate story, but you can see that these industries are changing quite rapidly. And here you can see some of those traditional industries, and they're not really traditional as of yet, but digital media, gaming, and ad tech, there's some of the, and if you move to the right, you can see where the industries really are of the future. Now we've actually, Courtney published this article actually on, we wrote an article on FDI 4.0, and it's just an example. It's not a sort of a consultancy way of selling a new concept of FDI, but we call it FDI 4.0 because it relates very much to Industry 4.0, and it's a new form of FDI. It's in different industries and subsectors, as I mentioned before. It leads to transformation and innovation. There's different players behind FDI. It's different companies. Companies from different markets as well, not only from the traditional markets, but some of these companies are very small and operating in emerging markets as well. They take more different forms of FDI, hybrid forms of FDI, new forms of investment, as I mentioned, strategic partnerships, joint ventures, strategic alliances, but they also have different requirements. They're looking for different things in foreign markets. A traditional company would look at, for instance, different sites that are available. These companies are looking for offices. They're not looking at offices that are very remote in the countryside or anything. They're looking at offices in urban hubs where there's talent, where there's young people that they could employ. They're looking at ways of collaborating with education or universities in specific jurisdictions. So, and they're looking to collaborate, not only to compete as well. The focus of these companies and of the employees that they employ is on sustainability and SDGs. I think Courtney has also mentioned ESGs as well. There are many, if you don't have a policy as a company today related to ESGs or SDGs, it will be very difficult to attract talent. And the flip side of that is, and we've seen that in practice, is that many of those young and emerging companies actually would prefer to go to locations, to go to countries that also have a philosophy or a strategy or a policy towards SDGs and ESGs as well. So it's not only the window dressing as it was 20 or 25 years ago, it really relates to concept, it really relates and appeals to companies that want to grow in the new industries and want to attract young talent. It's not only the people that the staff that demands it, but the companies as well. And many of the traditional companies are looking for this as well. If you, as a country, don't have a mission or a vision or a philosophy or a strategy towards how you will deal with those investments in terms of an ESG, from an ESG perspective, or how you sort of transform the SDGs into real investment policies, you have the risk of losing out on some of the investments. I think the example that Courtney gave from Sinde is very important. So they only focus. Don't be too strict, because, but make us visualize how you would like to see investments in the future, how they take care of sustainability, for instance, how they take care of the ESG policies and the SDGs of the UN. Do you have any examples as an organization? Do you have examples of how you embed these concepts into your investment attraction or investment promotion strategy? No one puts up their hand. I get really worried, because then we're talking about something that yes, sir, you do. Yeah. Can you share with the audience? Okay. It's a long word, yeah. Okay, very good. And what's the response of corporate investors? How do they respond? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, good, very good. Anyone else has some examples? Even when you're discussing potential investment projects with investors, do they mention it? Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, good example. Anyone else? Yes. Do you have experience in terms of how corporate investors respond to this? Or? Yeah, yeah. Okay. Good to hear. So what you actually, from these examples, what you learn is that companies now are not reluctant to hear those stories. They're actually quite open to and receptive to hearing those stories. While 20 years ago was very different. I think sustainability, the SDGs weren't there yet, but sustainability was sort of more or less window dressing. I remember when Shell Exploration and Production produced its first environmental sustainability annual report, which was done by I think it was by KPMG. It had no substance. It was basically window dressing. And I'm not accusing Shell of anything, but being sustainable as an oil, petroleum and refining company is extremely difficult. So that was more or less 20 years ago. But today it's starting to become much more realistic and it's become more implementable and pragmatic. Do you have any examples, Courtney, as well? You mentioned Sinde is a good example as well.
Well, I do think there are some, I guess, regional disparities because, you have, Sinde is a kind of leader in Latin America on this front, but you've had some of the agencies in North and Western Europe that have been doing this a while, but we're starting to see increased interest throughout the rest of the world at applying some of this criteria. There's just sometimes a knowledge gap as to how to do it, which is understandable because it is very difficult to do. Something I think is interesting, and it's probably a topic that you could talk about on its own for hours, is one of the difficulties, and this is an example, but more challenge, I guess I'm cheating, is around how you measure ESG, which is an entire landmine. And there are really cultural and regional and nation-specific differences in how to apply ESG. So if you look at social policies, for example, companies have a really difficult time because their own ESG policies might forbid them from investing somewhere, for example, that doesn't have equality of gender. Equality of sexual orientation is a real complicated topic, and the companies themselves struggle with how to live up to their own. Companies, for example, if you're from Northern Europe, companies like IKEA have really strict policies about ESG that relate to sexual orientation, but there are many emerging markets where there are laws that would actually flout that company's ESG criteria. And that puts you as investment agencies in a difficult spot because the companies themselves have to decide how flexible they want to be. So ESG is very difficult to apply, and you have to think about what does ESG mean to you, but also what does it mean to the companies that you're actually trying to attract, and how are you both on both sides of the equation defining it. And again, I think in a case like Sinde, why I think they're interesting is that they've just decided to apply it quite strictly. and go and bet on themselves in a way and not take investments. But when you're sort of, sometimes the desperation for investment can cause you to sort of lose sight of those standards, not just ESG, but SDG and sustainable development criteria, whereas it's better usually to play the long game if you can and stick to those standards, even if it means you lose a project or two here or there.
Thanks, Courtney. I got a question as well, what we meant with different IPAs. The requirements of FDI 4.0 are different, so it involves a different role than an IPA can also play, but I'll come back to that. One of them is a different sort of way of advising the companies in terms of investments, but also in terms of what you do internally towards digital FDI or digitalization of your own services. So we'll have a few slides on that as well. Courtney, I think we addressed this already a bit, but you mentioned FDI industries of the future in relation to Industry 4.0. Can you highlight a few of them?
Yeah, and this kind of ties to thinking about the industry. FDI 4.0 is, of course, you have your key sectors that you're trying to focus on, but it's worth thinking about not just the sectors of today and those that you have strengths in, but what are the big industries of the future and how can you actually enhance your competitiveness in those sectors. And yeah, we've talked about SDG. One thing I would add is that it is increasingly important to companies. There's some data from Global Data, who many of you saw this company present earlier. They have a company analytics database where they study keywords in company reports. And since 2016, there's been a notable increase in the number of times that in major company reports the words SDGs are coming up. So companies really care about it. It's a great opportunity for you to maximize that. Tech, we've kind of talked about that. One thing that we'll talk about a bit later is that not only looking at the technologies of the future in terms of how can you provide the right skills to be able to attract companies that are leading the tech revolution, but how you yourselves can be aware of these technologies to make your own jobs easier. And we'll get to that. Data centers is booming as a sector, and that's worldwide, and there are masses of opportunity. So it's worth thinking about your offer if you think you can be competitive in that. Investors that I talk to a lot, in terms of money investors, not greenfield investors, are obsessed with data centers. They're always looking for opportunities of data centers investments globally. Yes?
Does this differ across segments of investors? I'm just wondering, large investors conscious about their brands might have a quite different take on this issue than...
You mean, and when you mean SDGs? Yeah, well, it can vary by size and brand, but again, also culture, geography. But there is a wholesale increase. So again, when I'm talking about the company reports, that would obviously relate to large public companies. And there is a notable uptick in let's say, Fortune 500 companies and how much they care about it. But is it across the board? Well, no, I couldn't, I'd say a broad trend, but different companies have different policies. However, it's increasingly an issue for them in terms of their consumers and their customers, and there is pressure from their customer base to be sustainable, to have corporate social responsibility. So there is a pressure coming from the consumer community as well, which means that every company sooner or later will have some policy in place. It's just what that policy means is going to vary.
And I think your question is quite right. What you see also with, in terms of companies accepting tax credit or financial incentives, you also see cultural or geographical differences. I remember when you talk about, for instance, Japanese companies, you just take an example, they would never negotiate in terms of paying taxes. For them, that's a logical thing. If you set up your facilities elsewhere, it's culturally normal to just pay taxes. Well, I know you're from the US, but if you take the case for Amazon, it just publishes it in international newspapers. We're going to set up a new headquarters somewhere in the US. Come on, states, put in your proposition. Give us as much money as you can, and for every job that we create. For a cultural perspective, even that is perceived as strange for Europeans, but especially strange for Japanese investors because they would never do so. Well, in the US, it's a normal thing to have a sort of a locational tournament and sort of have the bids between the different states, and it's quite logic that you do so. While in Europe, you would hear things like Amazon. Don't they make 60 billion a year or something? Why would they do this? But it's a normal thing. It's a cultural thing. And I'm not saying anything is better than the other, but you would see this also with the SDGs. But eventually, everybody sort of merges towards the center and would have some sort of a policy.
I guess one thing to add, just to make it more complicated, is there are subnational differences as well. So in the U.S., for example, there are certain states, including my home state of Alabama and Texas as well, that have actually passed and I think Florida is the latest, that passed anti-ESG legislation, that actually disincentivizing companies to have such policies or people to invest in ESG funds. So, we can't say that it's completely uniform across the board. And it's hard for companies to navigate that, because what makes you a good corporate citizen or investor in Boston makes you a terrible one in Birmingham, Alabama. So this is the thing we have to navigate. But the broad trend, I would say those places are probably against the general global trend. Conscious of time, I won't go much more. Renewables, you all know that there's a boom in renewables and its importance to SDG criteria and net zero initiatives. Industry 4.0, Douglas has covered very well. So I just wanted to shine a little bit of a spotlight on gigafactories, because obviously this is a major industry of the present, but also the future. And the future is that the capacity for global gigafactories is set to absolutely explode over the next decade. And I know these are really highly sought after projects. So most of you probably covet some of these factories. The good news is there's going to be more of them. Global Data, my former employer, who many of you saw a presentation from, basically a business intelligence firm, so they have a lot of data on company activity, estimates that as much as $177 billion will be invested in gigafactories worldwide up until 2030. In 2020, there were 66 of such factories, but by 2030, there should be 155 or so. The factories are getting larger and they're more dispersed, so many more opportunities to win these projects. Currently, China is winning the race to attract gigafactories. Europe's share is set to grow, but the U.S., of course, is desperate to win this race and is throwing major subsidies, which is speaking of the issue of incentives and subsidies, is actually bearing fruit with a number of major gigafactory projects being announced recently.
In that sense, Courtney, if I just make a comment, you don't see a difference in the U.S. between the policies in that respect.
No,
in terms of Democrats or Republicans, they have the same policy. So that doesn't matter. They're going to be spending billions of dollars to try to attract the gigafactories and semiconductors as well.
Absolutely. So just spend a few words on, this kind of fits into maybe the newer or at least broader forms of investment that have, this is not a new form of investment, but investment agencies, you increasingly are concerned with the need to track institutional FDI. Now, the importance is, of course, this can help meet your sustainable development goals, but fund assets that you need investment in, like real estate, infrastructure, and so on. But it's a whole different game. It's a different language, really, from attracting your typical greenfield FDI. If you were in the previous seminar, Dushyant did a really great explanation of institutional FDI and what it means for you. So I won't repeat that, and also in the interest of time, and we will have a special workshop on this on the 9th at 9 a.m., but just safe to say it's a different type of investment that's focused on different things. So what's less relevant is not your location, your attributes, your talent pool. All those things that we normally talk about for attributes for greenfield FDI are different. Institutional FDI is concerned with assets, with projects, with returns. It's much more financially based, and you need to have specific projects and opportunities to present and to have run financial models to be able to talk and seek investment. So the general kind of FDI attractiveness factors are not completely irrelevant, but substantially less relevant. If you'll flip ahead, I won't go too much into the differences. You probably know and understand. Just safe to say that because these are different types of investors, their interests are slightly different, their decision making is different, and the way that you need to talk to them is substantially different. And there seems to be often a kind of, if you'll flip ahead, Douglas, sorry, if there's a bit of a language barrier. Now, what tends to happen is, I've mentioned that investors are really keen to invest, for example, in SDG-friendly projects, and not just at the company level, but at the institutional investor level. They have capital to deploy. They're looking for projects. They're looking for opportunities. They will very often say, well, there's a lack of investable or bankable projects. Well, there's not really a lack of projects. They're just not always being positioned and packaged in the right way, and there's a mismatch of expectations and information sharing on both sides. So on your side, you have an imperative to attract this type of investment and opportunities to offer, and investors want these opportunities. So how do we bridge the gap? And some of that is around what Dushyant showed earlier about actually knowing what your projects are. And this sounds really basic, but very often I will hear investment agencies talk broadly. We have opportunities in healthcare, but I'll say, what? What are they? Tell me the projects. You need to have the projects. A project portal is a fantastic tool to have it spelled out what the individual projects are, to be able to have packages of information that you can present. So it's about identifying what projects you have that could be appealing and presenting them and packaging them appropriately to the right kind of investors and avoiding generalities.
Thanks, Courtney. We've in fact in the past done workshops in terms of how you package those projects and what's the type of information that you need to have as an IPA in terms of when you want to position the projects for investments. And it's a different way of looking at the world of FDI. Mm-hmm. It's not really that difficult because you focus on a few items that are really essential. Dealing with risks, etc., is critical. Returns on investments. And we've actually seen those one pages that just describe a vague project but doesn't really focus on the nitty-gritty, which is important for an institutional investor.
This we've touched on, so we probably don't need to belabor these points anymore. It's just, again, there's a direct line between your ability to engage institutional investors and your ability to help support SDG goals. So I would just highlight this again as another reason that that's important.
Attracting green FDI, I think, for the sake of time, I'm just going to quickly go through it. Green FDI is a number of things. The bottom three, I think, are more important for you, is sustainable investment projects, the ones that Courtney also mentioned, but also investments that take place in a sustainable way. And I think the examples that were given from Lesotho, I think it was, that is to look at it how you include sustainability in the type of investments that you are looking for. So you have sustainable investment projects like investors that are in solar or wind energy or in waste management, but you can also look at it, is this investment taking place in a sustainable way, or is it taking some of the SDGs into account in terms of equal pay or equal treatment, etc. And another way of looking at it, and that relates to the institutional FDI that Courtney was talking to, is in investments that help countries achieve the SDGs, which is important. And in fact, Matthew, you've done quite an extensive work on that with the World Economic Forum in terms of sustainable investments in SDGs. Anything that you could add that is relevant here for the audience?
You're absolutely right. There are different ways to see sustainability. I think it's important to unpackage it.
These are the pillars, ESGs, we've mentioned that already. And here are some examples of type of investment, sustainable FDI projects, of how you can look at the world of sustainable FDI. It offers a lot of examples of ways of, it looks at health and education, power, for instance. It takes into account a lot of things of sustainability, but also in terms of SDGs. Good to see that everybody's taking pictures, so it means it's really important. This is just a future of competitiveness of countries, and I'll leave this because I think we highlighted this quite a bit already. Fourth Industrial Revolution, new forms of FDI, sustainability. One of the last things that is important to mention, I think, in fact, there is a side conference here on smart cities as well. I just saw John Hanna coming in, but he's left again, I think. But he's going to be focusing, I think, a bit on smart cities. SEZs, in essence, if they're well developed, could become sort of hubs of smart cities, or where you can experiment doing smart cities. I know there's a number of SEZs worldwide. We're actually currently involved in a few projects that are looking at ways to create smart zones, or turning their SEZs into smart cities, and experimenting with some of the new technologies, like AI, face recognition, etc., but also looking at sustainability. What's the role of an IPA? And I think it's important for you to emphasize, or to understand, that there's a difference between investment promotion and investment facilitation. Promotion is the marketing stuff, and the way you do that, there's a lot that can be said about marketing. Courtney also just mentioned how you package this, how you communicate with investors. But investment facilitation, and I'm even going so far as to say that the people that are involved in investment promotion within your organization are not always the best people to facilitate investments. Thank you. I appreciate that. So, the marketeer, for instance, would say, come, invest, here is a brochure, here is some material. That is not investment facilitation. It's the people that sort of brand or make people aware that there is a country such as A or B or C, or a location where you can invest. It's brand awareness and it's image building. And I think this one is a diagram that we once created. It's a simple one, but it summarizes the main activities of what an IPA actually does. The first one is actually, this is about pre-investment stage. It's creating awareness. It's business development. It's creating the perception and the image building of your location or of your country. Image building and marketing. And this is where the typical activities of lead generation and targeting take place. But then, afterwards, once you have been able to identify some leads and some prospects that are potentially interested in establishing in your location, that's when the investor servicing takes place. The image building and marketing, lead generation and targeting takes place at conferences like this, where you first meet these investors and where you first start to communicate. But it's also important, once you have established that first point of contact, that you involve someone that really listens to what the concerns are and why the investor is considering your location to invest in. And that's when you talk about investment servicing and investment facilitation. Needless to say, investor aftercare is important. In some countries, policy advocacy is important as well. The people that facilitate investments and the people that actually stay in touch with investors in the long term. And I'm not talking about the 6 months or the year after the investment has landed. No, I'm talking about 5 to 10 years. Those are the ones that can advise policymakers and say, listen, we really need to do something about the environmental regulation or the permitting process, because many of our clients or many of our investors have experienced that, for instance, we say it takes 6 weeks, but it took 6 months. So why is it taking so long? So they are the ones that need to communicate to the wider government entities and perhaps publish a yearly report that summarizes the challenges investors face over the long term in operating in your location. I think it's a very good way. I've seen examples. We've worked, for instance, with chambers of commerce. Chambers of commerce are really good organizations because they stay in touch with companies. And in Finland, actually, we helped support them actually to work with some of those big companies, and they would actually voice their concerns. And the voicing their concerns can be very simple. And we translated it with the Chamber of Commerce, with the American Chamber of Commerce, towards recommendations in terms of policy changes. It's a very progressive way of looking at investment development and about changing your business environment or investment environment. But it's a good thing to do so because it's important. If you don't stay in touch with the investors in the long term, you lose track of what you're actually doing. Yes, please. Very good. Yeah, it's okay. And the ones that are involved in aftercare are also the ones that facilitate the new investment, right? Yeah, very good. Yeah, no, very good. And in fact, I must admit, we've used your country as an example of best practice for SEZ policies. Compliments there. Yes, please. Exactly. Yeah, agree. Aftercare is not only about, hearing the concerns, but it's also about the people here that do the investment promotion and marketing. They need to do hard work because they need to attract new investments. The people that do the aftercare are the ones have an easier job, because talking to an existing investor who's happy already, it's easier to expand that investment. It's like when somebody, you know, how much effort does, well, Apple is probably not a good example, but, you know, some of the, it's like after sales. Someone that's already purchased sort of a brand of a specific car is most likely to purchase another car of that same brand again. It's much easier. That's why if you want to buy a car and you walk into you know, a car shop and there's a car salesman, and many people try to stay away from car salespeople, the first question they ask, or they look outside, what kind of a car do you drive now? And if you're into a Toyota car sales and he sees that you're driving a Toyota, it's a much easier job because they know that you're already happy. Or they ask, is there a specific reason why you are here? Yeah, I like driving a Toyota. And then you think, bam, got it. 50% of the work done. So it's the same with existing investors. If they're happy, or if you're able to listen and generate some of their concerns and are able to translate that to policy making, it can be very beneficial. Okay, some of these services that you can provide are important. There's a lot to be said, but in terms of investment promotion, also make sure that you have the relevant material. It's a simple one, especially these days where everything is digital. For instance, what I noticed, actually I noticed that yesterday, I was actually looking for a specific IPA. Funny thing was, they didn't have the appropriate contact information. And it's a very simple one, and I keep emphasizing it. Or they don't have the country code on the website. And everybody's looking at me, really? But it is. Check your own IPA website. I bet, you know, some of you, you don't have to admit it. Don't send us an email. It's not a big mistake, but you can see it. And it's a bother of an investor that they need to look up. Okay, which country was this? Which is the country code? So you need to both, and they're focusing on foreign investment, but they don't have the country code there.
So, Douglas, we have about 10 minutes left, apparently.
Okay, good. No, let's not. Okay. The mandate that you have as an IPA is also important, and I'll go through that. And this is important, and this relates to budgets as well. Is your IPA responsible for only FDI, or is it also responsible for domestic investment, or for trade and export and tourism? And many of the international organizations, UNCTAD is a good example, and the World Bank have produced reports, and have a look into that. What works and what doesn't work. There's been loads of discussions. Should FDI be combined with export promotion or not? The rule of thumb is if you're not a real big country in terms of population size and in terms of GDP and FDI, it can make sense to combine the two. But it's clearly different. Attracting FDI is different than promoting exports. Where is your IPA positioned? In general, the ones that function quite good is the ones that are autonomous entity, that are more or less independent. FDI is extremely politicized these days because it's attached to political cycles. Every minister wants to make a good impression by landing some new investments, and that's important. So where you are positioned determines also the autonomy that you have, the flexibility that you have of determining your own fate as an organization, and it also expands upon how much budget is allocated to your organization. I think this is an important one. Let's focus on this one. Digitalization. And this is the strategic tools, and it's a summary where we sort of position, remember the 4 phases of the investment promotion cycle, image building and marketing, lead generation, targeting, the 4 ones. And this is the type of material you should have. Free to have a look at it because we're constrained by time. You can always send me an email or Courtney and what you think is important. But image building is a local value proposition. A value proposition is something different than, for instance, just a website. A value proposition really emphasizes why an investor should focus on your country. What's the value of it? Exactly. A brand is important as well, which has a mission and a vision. What are you trying to achieve? Why do you exist as an IPA? Yeah, sure. Yeah, but Investor Guide is very focused on the investment facilitation part, a good investor guide. But here you have, when you try to attract investment, is local value proposition is much more important.
It's like when you just type how to invest in,
Yeah.
and you go to investors.
Yeah, exactly. But then you go to the website, and what is most important then is to have the value proposition, which is detailed. The investor guide is very big, usually. But we've, the reason why we list it there is because an investor guide can be used also when you're servicing investors because it contains so much information. But if you're just in touch for the first time with the initial investor, then you can use the local value proposition, which is basically a one-pager or a two-pager. Best practice. Yes. Value proposition is what are the benefits of locating in your jurisdiction? What type of services do you offer as an organization? Which incentives are available? There's many examples. Yeah, no, there's some of the Scandinavian countries which are good. Baltic states. Do you have a good one?
Yeah, Finland does very
Finland
well at
has,
this.
yeah.
Finland, Estonia, and then IDA Ireland are always kind of the best at almost every part of the chain. So they're good examples to look at.
Yeah. NFIA, Netherlands Foreign Investment Agencies, not because that I'm from the Netherlands, but you can look at that one as well. Okay, oh, sorry, let's go back. Just quickly, this is actually how digitalization takes place. Digitalization is not only about IPAs digitalizing their activities, but it's also about attracting digital FDI. And you use new tools. And I think this one has grown exponentially, the third one, video conferencing. And Dushyant was here, and he's actually from Invest India. And I think Invest India had a few sessions during COVID about investing in India and investing in the different states and the value propositions. They had more than 1,000 attendees at one of the events. So it's really good. It works. And it actually allows you to do that first part of investment promotion digitally. And I know that we all like to travel, but sometimes it's much more effective than to use the video conferencing as well. Social media and LinkedIn was there already, but I think many of the IPAs have started to realize that it's really important to have a special person that is focused on digitalizing some of those activities and focusing on what you message on LinkedIn and social media, etc. Courtney, you want to quickly go through this one?
Yeah, I'll skip just to add, because we've got 4 minutes left, and I want to just mention it because I think this is overall good news for you, because investment promotion is obviously a very difficult job. What I think is exciting is that some of the changes taking place in technology, but in the media landscape, are actually creating opportunities and tools that help you work much smarter and better and more efficiently. And so I would urge you to kind of get to know these tools and these technologies. There's sometimes a sticker shock associated with them, but the value ultimately that you may get out of these compared with a static ad, for example, in an expensive broadsheet newspaper, is going to pay much bigger dividends. If you just go to the next slide, and I'm speaking from, not everyone knows, my background is that I spent 20-something years as a business editor at major media brands, so this is kind of really my area here. You know, the consumption of media has gone so much online, which is worth understanding, but again is good news for you, because they're also marketing tech solutions, and media companies have much better understanding now of who is reading the publications, who's reading the site, who's engaging with content, and that can give you some priceless intel. Because if you know who is looking at information about, who's looking at your investor guide, who's looking at Invest in Wherever, who's looking at articles about you, then you know those are companies that have interest in you. And so you can push and demand more transparency from your media suppliers in terms of who's looking at information about you. There's still maybe a place for, say, print magazines, for example, event distribution. But the challenge with print is that you don't know who sees your ad. There's no direct correlation. With new tools AI-led marketing tech solutions and things like that, and reader intel tools, you have a better understanding of getting this intel that takes you halfway down the road to lead generation. The caveat is that it is not pure lead generation itself, and you get out of these tools what you put into them, and they're not going to land an investment project for you, but they'll give you a bit of insight as to who is curious about your location. That's probably all I'll say about that.
Just a quick comment on printed material. There's probably one exception that really works well, which we have realized over the years. You know these booklets that you have when you sit in a plane? Those are very effective. There are so many times that I've heard investors say, I said, how did you come up with investing in that specific country? Yeah, I saw a nice ad or an editorial or something like that, because that's the only time that corporate executives have some time. You know, the time when these days we all have Wi-Fi in place, but when you take off, you can't put on your Wi-Fi, and everybody takes that piece of paper and looks into, oh, that's nice, Lithuania or Malta or whatever it could be. So it's one that you should carefully consider.
That's very true, and that's great for the brand awareness. You may not know that direct link, but it's for sure in terms of creating that brand.
Okay, I'll pass this one. This is a recent survey, 2020, of what really works of IPAs. This is from the World Bank and WIPA, I think it was done. And you could see that LinkedIn is probably, across all these types of activities, is very, very effective. So I would always say focus on LinkedIn and Twitter probably as your main mechanisms for communicating through social media. This is how we sort of put the cycle together in terms of the 4 phases again, and you can actually see you know, the benefits of some of the level of digitalization. And increasingly these days, I think it's one of the IPAs, I think, Polly was here this morning, but they were actually, there are some investors in some locations, I think it's also one of the Baltic states, that actually have site visits through virtual tools. They use drones, and you can actually experience how it is when you're operating on a site. To consider. And one of the good things is about, you know, some of these tools, they are budget friendly. They take time, but they're not expensive. LinkedIn is actually, how much does LinkedIn cost? It's free as a person, but as a company, probably $40 or $50 a month, and then you can use it. So, and some of these virtual tools are also very effective. This is all about performance management, where we don't have much time for it, but I think it's important for you as an IPA to communicate to the rest of the government what your role is and how effective you are and how it contributes to the economic development of a country. And go beyond the traditional indicators, as we mentioned at the start of the presentation. So I think if we need to have some conclusions here, because we are aware of the time, the changing context for FDI, we did explain the external factors that have an impact on your organization. Research is important. You talked about data intelligence, Courtney, as well. There are many databases where you can actually focus on specific sectors and markets. I mentioned the guys and girls in the UK that are setting up a new sort of databases on new companies in these emerging technologies. Digitalization is important. Establishing clear KPIs for your organization is important. It may sound boring and it may sound difficult, but it is important for you to communicate the wider impact of FDI. Not just jobs, you can start with that, but think about ways how you can do that. Institutional collaboration, we've heard examples. Work with the SEZs. Don't treat them as sort of outside of your domain. It's important. And I think collaborating with the rest of the government is also very important. And collaborating with the rest of the government, that's why I always, you know, I've used this one before. It's important that this is a pack of wolves. And I think when you work, FDI is teamwork. If you look at FDI projects that are managed by companies, you would see 5 or 6 people involved. There's obviously always the person that is involved with the financial parts of it. There's the project manager, the person from HR, an engineer. So you should match that also within your organization as well when you approach investors and when you work towards attracting FDI. There are many different departments within your government that are involved in attracting FDI. But mind you, it's like a pack of wolves, and it's not always, they're always not always walking the same speed as you would like to have them walk. Think about working with some of the ministries or some of the departments. I see people smiling already, that it's sometimes difficult to get them moving and say, this is really important for us. But remember, and if you look at a pack of wolves, the leader of a pack of wolves is not the first one. It's actually the last one, so he keeps the oversight. So that's where you should walk. So actually the weak ones walk up front because they determine the pace. So that's how you should look at it as well. Push your government and push your ministries and the departments that you work with towards a common goal. And I think there's a famous proverb in Africa, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, you go with a team, you go with each other. So I think that's a famous one. So all the best with attracting investment. We need to close here given the time that we have, but we're both available. If you have any questions, we're also on Twitter and LinkedIn, and you have, I think it's all in the information pack as well. Any questions still, or shall we close here?
We're out of time, I think, but thank you so much
Yep.
for your attention.